Hi, Miriam.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Carrie.
Yes.
Miriam will need to be able to share.
Oh, okay.
Give her. Hi, Jan.
I took me a while to get the unmute working.
Two Jans.
Oh, well, that's right. Yes.
Hi, Jan and Jan. Janice and Janice, too.
Whatever.
Hey there.
Hey, Scott. Are you in, are you at home or you look like you're in an airplane or something?
Yeah, I am not at home right now.
Oh. Fair enough. Um, all right. Scott's here, Jan's here. Bob said he might be a little bit late. He's driving to the Cape, but he's got his computer with him and he will be joining us as soon as he can, which he thought would be pretty close to 7. So he'll just join when he can. But so it's 7 p.m. on June 26th, and I'm calling this meeting of the Shutesbury Conservation Commission to order. This meeting is being recorded. So tonight's a special meeting. It's basically it's a meeting to review proposed changes to our regulations. We've got Miriam DeFont and Janice Stone here. They're both former Shutesbury Conservation Commissioners. And they're going to, they've taken the time to go through the current regulations, make changes, based on our new
But I just got
bylaw.
onto it.
Oop.
I'm sorry, I just got onto a meeting.
Yep. Hi, Mary. Anyway, yeah, so they've made some changes based on our new bylaw, but then also just based on some, newest kind of updates, I guess, newest things that are out there. And they're gonna go through that tonight. I'm kind of hoping that we just kind of get into it and maybe try to get through half of it. Maybe get through the inland resource area section before we take any comments. Just to see how far we get, but then at that point is when I would thought the commission could start making some comments, just so that we can get through a lot of it. Yeah, and I guess, and also just so folks know, this is just a this is just a review of these proposed changes. The commission will be taking this information, kind of deciding really on our own what we want to do with the regulations in terms of updating it. And then when we get to a point where we're happy with it, we would be holding a public hearing at one of our meetings where we would go through sort of the final changes and vote on them. So tonight is just sort of a beginning of just looking at these proposed changes. What else did I want to say? Oh, just that this is having to do with the bylaw. Donna McNichol, the town attorney, is going to come to, or the town council is going to come to our next meeting, our first meeting in July, to go through the comments that we got from the Attorney General on the bylaw. I talked about them at our last meeting. They're very basic comments, but pretty much every comment ends with, go through this with your town council and, get your town council's opinion on this comment. So I was happy that she's been very busy, but she finally has time to come to our first meeting in July and go through those comments with us. All right, so if commissioners are ready, we can just have Miriam take over. She's gonna do a presentation. All right, Miriam?
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Conservation Commission, for allowing Janice and I to come tonight and share our recommendations with you. We really appreciate that. I hope it's constructive and gives you some place to jump off at. I'm hoping we can get through these pretty quickly because a number of the changes are going to be very minor ones that I don't think are going to be requiring a lot of discussion. Some of them you may want to have more in-depth discussion about. What I wanted to do, maybe to just orient everybody, was I put together a few PowerPoint slides, and then I thought I would screen share the annotated draft that I distributed to the commission, and we could just go through those changes and you can see what our thought process is. Does that sound okay to everybody? Okay. So I'm
Okay.
going to, let's see if I can find the right. Okay. All right. Can everybody see the slides? Yeah. Okay.
Yep,
So
we can.
what?
I said, yes, we can. Thanks,
Right.
Miriam.
So just to remind everybody that, and I know this has been discussed before, but the bylaw was adopted and is passed by town meeting and approved by the Attorney General. But regulations are the rules and policies that are adopted by each Conservation Commission that outline the way in which they're interpreting the bylaw and applying it for regulatory decisions. So regulations define terms and explain standards and procedures and sort of flesh out the more minimal language that's in a bylaw. It establishes fees. And really regulations, as I've come to understand it, serve as an analytical tool for the commission in its decision-making in order to ensure some predictability and consistency and fairness. Communities revise regulations over time to keep up with evolving science and standards. And we learned that in 2022, there was a Supreme Judicial Court ruling in the Boston versus Quincy court case that has established in Massachusetts the need for conservation commissions to adopt regulations if they have a bylaw and wish to have that bylaw be legally valid in their permitting decisions. That the regulations must explain the standards for how the bylaw differs from the Wetlands Protection Act. And as you know, we've talked before, regulations are not permit instructions for applicants. They're really roadmaps for the commission, and the commission, it would be beholden on the commission to create permit instructions for applicants to follow based on the regulations. But it would never be expected that an applicant would need to go to the regulations and digest them all in order to figure out how to apply for a permit. So we had an old bylaw and old regulations that had been adopted over 20 years ago. In 2023, there was some updates to the regulations based on the old bylaw. This year, the town meeting adopted a new bylaw, which is now approved and effective. And so the regulations from 2023 are no longer valid because they're based on a different bylaw. And so with our new bylaw, we have new values or purposes and new defined jurisdictional resource areas. There's language about climate change and resilience now in the bylaw, and some improvements in the presumptions and performance standards that the commission needs to follow in making decisions. And there's the addition of a small project permit, which didn't exist under the previous bylaw. So those are some of the main areas that really require some attention. So just briefly, the kind of approach that I think Janice and I are thinking about in terms of, and Janice, speak up if you want to, if I miss something, for how to approach doing this update like maybe spell it correctly first, is that really some changes are more discretionary than others. There are some changes really have to be made because the bylaw has different terms now. And the regulations must track the bylaw and match its language. And at the same time, you want to maintain some consistency, I think, in your overall approach and procedures and standards. It doesn't make sense to have dramatic changes in terms of current practice and policies. But some terms and jurisdictional definitions probably need to be revised. And in addition to some of those changes, what I'm suggesting, or what Janice and I talked about, is two kind of more substantive changes. One is to consider changing the tree replacement formula under vegetation removal and replacement, really simplifying it and making it less burdensome for applicants. And adopting some rules and standards for docks and water-based structures that would align with current Concom practice. And then, there were some minor formatting and punctuation corrections that showed up. So these are the sections, just in a word, that we're going to kind of talk about as a brief overview of what this includes, what kind of changes need to happen. The bylaw values that are quoted in the regulations must track what are in the bylaw. And we have a number of new values that were not in the original bylaw. The jurisdictional resource areas, which are the areas where the commission reviews projects for impact, have changed so that vernal pools are now a resource area in and of themselves, rather than being a subtype of isolated wetlands. Bank, springs, hillside seeps, intermittent streams, and the 200-foot riverfront area are all now spelled out in the bylaw, and so they need to have that language reflected in the regulations. The bylaw also includes some general presumptions and performance standards. It discusses practicable alternatives as an analytical tool for riverfront area projects, which tracks with state riverfront area regulations. And so that those presumptions and performance standards need to be incorporated into the regulations because they're in the bylaws specifically. And in terms of exemptions, there's a couple of exemptions in the bylaw that need to be spelled out in the regulations, namely for agriculture and mosquito control. There are a number of new terms in the bylaw, so we're recommending definitions to reflect a number of them. There's a little bit different language for hardship waivers in the bylaw, and so the regulations should reflect that language. And then there were just some terminology changes, like there were a number of places where the regulations refer to wetlands, and because the bylaw defines a whole category of things as freshwater wetlands, we just were suggesting being consistent and using freshwater wetlands because that's the term in the bylaw. In the old regs, there was this kind of distinction between isolated wetlands and isolated vegetated wetlands, the IVW acronym there. And that distinction is no longer really necessary. So we're suggesting getting rid of that. Intermittent streams, in the previous regulations, they were called subsurface streams because that was just like the old language from the 1987 bylaw, but now they're being called intermittent streams, which sort of tracks with how these resource areas are described statewide. So we want to have a consistent language. So that's that. And should we just move on and start looking at the document? Okay, let me pull that up. Give me 1 second. I have open on my desktop also a copy of the old regs and the bylaw, but if there's any questions and we need to refer to the new bylaw, maybe somebody else can have a copy open. Okay. I think this is the document. Okay, great. let me get to the top. Everybody can see this document? So I would suggest having some sort of what I've seen with other regulations for other communities, that they have a little legislative history. Yeah, Carrie?
It's kind of cropped. Like it looks like I'm only looking at half of what I should be. I don't know if that's showing up for anyone else. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Just had to expand the window. Having a little legislative history at the top. And these dates, I don't have the effective date for the bylaw. It would be effective the date that it was posted by the town clerk, so you'd have to add that. So just for everyone's information, here's the whole table of contents. And I've highlighted areas that I changed. And I have some comments if that I may try to reference. So in this Article 1, there are certain references like where, it's referring to a section of the bylaw and the section numbers have changed. So we need to make sure that the regulations track with the actual correct sections of the bylaw. But I believe the section that allows regulations in the new bylaw is section 9. The resource area values are basically the purposes of a bylaw that justify what the bylaw is protecting, what are the environmental values, environmental interests that are in the public good and are being protected on behalf of the public. And in the Wetlands Protection Act, they're called interests, but to make them distinct from bylaws, a lot of communities call these purposes values for bylaws. So here's just a list of those values. And then the areas of jurisdiction, or the resource areas, which is, where on the landscape the commission has authority to look at things and to issue permits, are in these areas. And this is taken straight from the new bylaw, and it is worded differently than the old one. And as mentioned, has springs in it, which were not called out in the old bylaw. It's got bank. It's got the 200-foot riverfront area of any perennial stream, which is also protected under the state law, and bordering an isolated land subject to flooding. And it has the 100-foot buffer zone, or aura, adjacent upland resource area, which is protected as a resource area, not just a buffer zone to a resource area. Okay. Here are the definitions of activities that are regulated. And this is, again, this language is taken from the new bylaw. Then in the new bylaw, there's a bunch of general presumptions or performance standards. And so just for the sake of consistency, I'm just adopting those word for word in the regulations, just restating them, but putting them under general presumptions. And this is all verbatim from the bylaw. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on that. Whether those are in the regulations or in the bylaw, they still are part of the commission's charge. All right. Then under exemptions and exceptions, again, there's a couple of changes for agricultural exemptions. So this is, again, language taken from the bylaw. And there's a little bit of language changes for emergency projects, but really it hasn't changed substantively. And there's this added provision that the bylaw does not regulate mosquito control because that's preempted by state law. And then again, there was minor activities within the aura that the previous regulations we had adopted, and I'm not recommending any change here, basically adopting all of the minor activity exemptions under the Wetlands Protection Act, except for accessory structures. And those are either regulated under the bylaw or through an RDA or an NOI or a small project permit. And that's all of that. Any questions from the commission?
I think we should just keep going.
Going, all right, I'm just gonna plow through. Okay,
Yeah.
a
I think we
butter,
should.
okay, a butter, this is just a standard definition of a butter. It wasn't in the previous regulations. I think this may be from the bylaw, but it's 100-foot buffer, 100-foot of butters is what the state requires under the Wetlands Protection Act, and so the commission and the bylaw tracks with that. Activity, again, definition is taken from the bylaw. Adaptation, measures designed or intended to protect resource areas from adverse effects of climate change and to protect the ability of resource areas to mitigate. Definition here of the aura, again, from the bylaw. Adverse effect is also in the bylaw, and the term agent is in the bylaw. Alter, again, these are all definitions that are in the bylaw, but were not in our previous regulations. So where you see yellow is where I believe the wording is different now. So, a bank in here as a definition that was also defined in the previous regulations. All of these are the same as the previous set of regulations against the, buffer zone is the synonymous with aura, and now it tracks with 2A and 2C of the bylaw. Now here under competent source, Janice and I had a discussion about the definition of a competent source. So a competent source is an individual that the commission deems has enough expertise to provide credible evidence in a hearing or in support of an application. And Janice, do you want to express your reasoning about this?
Oh, okay. I just felt that I like the idea of someone should have a master's degree in science or ecological science and that sort of thing. And then the other choice was, or 2 years of training and experience. And to me, that was not an equivalent. And that there should be a little tougher standard than 2 years, which can be very broad and really not that helpful for someone to be called a competent source. So we thought, well, at least 2 years of full-time training and experience or their equivalent in wetland plant and soil identification, just because this competent source comes up in a number of places. And I felt like there should be, a fair amount of background for the person who is giving testimony or whatever, and the commission has to decide whether to accept their interpretation of the situation.
And by putting in the clause or their equivalent, it means, there would be some flexibility for the commission. Maybe somebody's had 5 years part-time experience or something else that equivalent in the eyes of the commission seems adequate. So, so there'd be some flexibility built into this. Okay. Conditions, consultants, cumulative effect is taken from the bylaw, I believe. Let me just double check. Yes, I think that's right. Again, all of these are not substantive changes here. Freshwater flood control have added the prevention or reduction of flooding or damage, both as currently expected to occur and as projected based on the best available data regarding the impacts of climate change. So there needs, when we talk about flood control, we talk about increased precipitation and over time, not just because climate patterns are changing. Freshwater wetlands, again, these are languages taken from the bylaw, and freshwater wetlands can be bordering or isolated. And freshwater wetlands can also include some wetlands that may not be vegetated. For example, a spring or a hillside seep or a vernal pool are protected resources and have delineation characteristics, but aren't necessarily vegetated. Groundwater definition, I added the word riverfront area because that's also a regulated resource area that wasn't included in the previous set of regulations. And I think Here under imminent risk to public health and safety, there was a list of different kinds of public officials that might authorize an emergency permit, but it doesn't have to be an exclusive list. So we said, or other public agency. There needs to be some public agency that makes a determination that there is an imminent risk to public health and safety, apart from the commission. Intermittent stream, this is basically, can you see this was a definition that we used in the previous set of regulations, but we called it a subsurface stream. And this was after having consultation with a wetland scientist that we hired as a consultant, Patrick Garner, who helped us kind of think through the thought process that having the maximum protected distance between inlet and outlet would be 200 feet. So there'd be kind of a 100-foot buffer zone that would basically be overlapping that length. But if it was longer than that, then it would lose protection. All right, mean annual high water line. This is just kind of a very detailed definition of mean annual high water line that's commonly used concept under state law. And added obstructions or objects in water. This is a definition from Chapter 91 of the state law that's used for the Chapter 91 waterways program and DEP waterways program. Permit, again, sort of a permit is a document issued by the commission. Here are some of the examples of permits, but not an exhaustive list, because you could have an order or a letter authorizing something that, essentially is a kind of a permit. Persons, pond, practicable alternative, I think is from the bylaw, and rare species is from the bylaw. Recreation, resilience, a definition of river, spring, a definition of what a spring is. And I think that is, and vernal pool. This is, again, a definition based on the definition in the bylaw, but adds a little bit more information. And that's okay you can expand on a definition in regulations if it's defined in the bylaw. You just can't have it be an inconsistent. You can add more detail, but you can't define it as being something different from how the bylaw is defining it. So there's some language here about the aura of vernal pools and the exemptions also of where a vernal pool is not, I believe, is in there. Maybe that's down below. Okay. Water dependent uses, again, this is a definition from state law. And I think that's all there is for definitions. So Article 3, general provisions, the burden of proof, this is just quoted from the bylaw. This section on hardship waivers is again from the bylaw specifically. So we had language in the previous regulations very similar to this. And in general, you'll see in these regulations this kind of repeated sort of theme of avoid, minimize, and mitigation, which is the general performance standard that the bylaw establishes for how an applicant would justify the work that they wish to have approved, that they would demonstrate to the commission to its satisfaction that reasonable efforts have been taken to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse effects. And this allows for waivers based on, a judgment from the commission that the waiver is necessary because otherwise there are no other alternatives that are practicable or reasonable for the applicant and would prohibit otherwise their use of their land, and that they're making reasonable efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. Okay. So none of this has changed. Under stormwater management, just added some additional preambles language. And so just as a reminder, a preamble is really kind of background information, scientific information that is useful for the commission to reference in its findings. But it doesn't necessarily involve different standards for what an application needs to look like or what an applicant needs to do. So I added a little bit more information about the impacts of stormwater runoff. And I thought this would be helpful to the commission. The commission shall presume that control, treatment, and recharge of stormwater runoff to current scientific and engineering standards is significant to the values. So, you know, again, that can change over time, and you know, there are limits to what people can do for managing stormwater. So whatever is the current best practices would probably be the go-to standard that the commission would look at. And then in performance standards, I've changed a little bit of the wording here, but again, it's really essentially the same as what the original regulations were. Again, applicants need to demonstrate that there's no significant change in offsite runoff from existing conditions, that pre-project, post-project hydrologic budget. There needs to be at least some effort to avoid, minimize, and mitigate loss of pervious surfaces in areas that are under the jurisdiction of the commission, so in resource areas. And again, this section has a little bit of information about how the commission might look at engineering standards and engineering studies around stormwater, and that you know, if an applicant is able to show that their project is not going to have an adverse effect, or conversely, I think what we added was that if they can show that putting in a stormwater feature might actually harm some other down gradient resource area because it might overtop and flood somewhere else off the applicant's property, for example, that might be a reason for flexibility, because obviously the commission wouldn't want to approve something that was going to damage a resource area somewhere else. All right. And then under resource area delineations, this is all pretty much the same, except that I just want to make it clear that delineation of the boundary of a resource area, there's different methodologies for different kinds of resource areas. So wetland delineations based on vegetation and soils is appropriate, and surface hydrology for bordering vegetated wetlands, isolated wetlands, you know, possibly land subject to flooding, etc. But it is not the way that intermittent streams or vernal pools would be defined, or hillside seeps and springs. So we might want to add that in this sentence here. The other resource areas that are not included in that standard BVW methodology. So I added a reference to a state publication from Mass Wildlife that describes the vegetational communities that are characteristic of hillside seeps and forest seeps, since that is a resource area that does have some specific, unique kind of vegetational pattern. And again, I changed the word to freshwater wetland. I capitalized it, I think. It wasn't capitalized before. So let me move on. No changes here to wildlife habitat. I think that was all the changes for this section. here under Title V, added the word riverfront area because that was not protected under the previous bylaw. Just changed the term here a little bit, because it said the commission shall only review construction before, and I said, I added construction phase impacts. I think the word phase wasn't in it. And then this is a section that is somewhat new. I looked at a number of towns that have great ponds and looked at what they do in terms of their bylaws, if they have a bylaw, and regulations, and found several towns that had this section in their regulations. So I drafted this. The commission can decide whether or not it finds this helpful. Basically, it has some preamble about the impact of what is referred to as water dependent structures. So these are structures that are unique to land underwater, water bodies, lakes, ponds, and rivers. So it might be docks, piers, floats, things of that nature that you wouldn't have on land. And what some of the potential factors are in considering their impact on the environment, the issues around them being subject to the Mass Public Waterfront Act, which is Chapter 91, and that there's this kind of relationship between the commission's authority and DEP's authority. The DEP has independent authority for permitting docks. However, they require that a valid order of conditions or determination be obtained before they'll issue a license for a dock. So they are linking their permitting process to the commission's jurisdictional review. So there's some definitions of terms and then the presumptions. And, I think one of the decision points, and I think you should discuss this. I wrote this with the assumption that an order of conditions would be required, because in some instances, the commission has required dock applications to fall under notices of intent when there was other work being proposed. And it struck me that there's some benefit to doing it under an order of conditions, because then the commission has the ability to ascertain whether or not the Chapter 91 license was actually obtained or not. If you do a determination of applicability, there's no follow-up to that. There's no review, there's no certificate of compliance. So you would never have an opportunity to go back and see, well, we ordered them to get a Chapter 91 license. Did they actually do it? And currently, the way the commission's been writing permits is saying that they would, in order to get a certificate of compliance, people would have to show that they had gone through that process and gotten the license. Or if they couldn't get the license for some reason, that they had discontinued using the dock. So you kind of lose that opportunity if you're not using a notice of intent process. And I think that's something for the commission to figure out, because you're holding some people to one standard if you're doing it under an NOI, and you're holding people to a different standard if you're doing it under an RDA. And it seems to me like there needs to be some consistency for these kinds of projects. Okay. Now we're into standards for inland wetlands. And again, bank is now a resource area, but not much has changed in the language, except for the references in the bylaw. This isn't a change, it's just a formatting change. I think that this language was kind of glommed into one paragraph, and I broke it down into separate lines, but it's basically the same content that was previously in the regs. Under state law, if you are altering more than 10% of the length of a bank or 50 linear feet, whichever is less, on a single lot or cumulatively for multi-lot projects, the applicant has to complete a wildlife habitat evaluation. So this is adopting the same language that is in the CMR 310 CMR 10.00, which is the state regs for the Wetlands Protection Act. And you'll see down below for a couple of other resource areas, we've adopted the same language because the regs for the state also have this same clause about there being this threshold of impact. If you're altering a certain amount, you have to do a wildlife habitat evaluation anyway. It's just basically making the standard consistent. Okay, freshwater wetlands, here again, sort of modifying the language to include the language from the Wetlands Protection Act. I'm sorry, the bylaw. And it has some information here about what a hillside seep is. This is definition that I believe came from Natural Heritage. And this is all the same. This is just another preamble concept. Freshwater wetlands and their aura serve to moderate and alleviate thermal shock and pollution resulting from runoff. So thermal shock being important because of climate change. And what else do we have? Okay, again, more information about hillside seeps and a reference to the resource area delineation, Article 3. But hillside seeps can have wetland vegetation around them, but because they're in an upland area, they often have non-wetland trees in the canopy layer. So the vegetation community is different than you'd see for a BBW. Under isolated vegetated wetlands, which are defined as at least 500 square feet in surface area under the bylaw. This phrase that I haven't read was in the previous regulations, and that seemed confusing to me and unnecessary. There are other methods to delineate an isolated vegetated wetland using just standard delineation methods, and there's no need to reference storm events, I don't think. And Janice, I think you agreed with me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a typo. I don't know what happened here. Something got cut off. All right, well, I'll put that in red because it looks like some piece of this sentence got cut off. All right, so performance standards, nothing has changed except for, again, capitalizing. Vernal pools, again, no substantive changes. One thing that is different, however, is that the vernal pool of the aura of a vernal pool is treated as a resource area, and the previous regulations treated it as a no disturb zone. And that's pretty standard statewide, that the buffer zone or the aura of vernal pools is treated differently than the aura of other resource areas because vernal pools are so sensitive to development, and 100 feet is considered to be just really like the most minimal area of protection in order to protect the breeding life cycle of vernal pool species. But in some cases in the literature, they also refer to it as the vernal pool envelope. And I thought that it was just kind of a useful term to kind of, highlight the fact that vernal pools need to be kind of encapsulated in something protecting them. So that's why this is added. And again, just like it says in the bylaw, vernal pools do not extend and their envelope do not extend into previously developed areas. So if somebody had a vernal pool right on the edge of their lawn, it doesn't mean that their lawn becomes a no touch, no disturb zone. Previously disturbed areas are not, are exempt. And again, no changes here. Land under water bodies. I don't see any major changes here. again, land under water bodies can be under a stream, perennial or intermittent. It said subsurface before, I believe. Performance standards. I think this is pretty much what was in the original regs. And again, this language about if more than 10% or 5,000 square feet, whichever is less, of land under water and water bodies is to be altered, then a wildlife habitat evaluation is required. That is established under 310 CMR 10.6. Land subject to flooding. No real changes here. I added this phrase because I thought it was important in terms of clarifying a critical characteristic that bordering land subject to flooding may extend from a freshwater wetland if there is a BVW present. You can have layers of resource areas on top of each other. The boundary, 100-year frequency storm based on best available data. There are FEMA maps, but the regulations also reference more accurate and up-to-date precipitation data. And again, here again, for bordering land subject to flooding. One thing is that in this paragraph here, it says bordering land subject to flooding requires a wildlife habitat evaluation. I mean, isolated land subject to flooding is also protected under the bylaw. It's not protected in the same way on under state law. So, you know, I think a decision point for the commission would be, do you want it to say bordering land subject to flooding, or do you want it to say just land subject to flooding, which would include both? And so I would say that's, you know, a decision point that you should consider which way you want to go and what you think makes the most sense. All right. And then the aura, again, I don't think there were many changes. Here's just a term of buffer zone benefits for vegetated strips. And this language comes from, I believe, the MACC buffer handbook, that generally vegetated buffers of less than 50 feet in width within the aura are considered to be ineffective in protecting the wetlands and providing habitat function. So the reason for adding this is that this kind of lays the scientific ground, and there are lots of studies supporting this you can find in the MACC guidebook, the references, but this kind of establishes the scientific basis for why the commission might regulate a 50-foot no disturb zone. Kind of where that number comes from. So it's not arbitrary, it's based on a number of studies. And then some, again, this is all preamble. These are not regulation changes, but some information that might be helpful to the commission. Lawn areas recharge groundwater less efficiently than areas that are naturally vegetated. Thought process here is that sometimes we hear people saying, well, you know, I don't really want to plant shrubs and trees. I'm going to have grass. Isn't that good enough? And I think that having this language in the preamble gives the commission some foundation for having that conversation about what kind of vegetation is most appropriate for mitigation for a development project. And again, this is all kind of some of that preamble language. Under presumptions, again, this is all fairly consistent with what the previous regulations are about presuming that previously developed, except for I added this piece, previously developed, disturbed, and landscaped areas within the aura are lands determined by the commission to be of a legally modified nature, meaning that that work was allowed, which were altered before the adoption of these regulations, or under an order of conditions or other permit. Previously developed lands are those that are degraded with impervious surfaces. This is kind of defining this idea that there's previously disturbed things that the commission may exempt when it's reviewing a project. If there's undeveloped, undisturbed, or naturally developed vegetated areas within the project area, in an area subject to the commission's jurisdiction, that might be something the commission might want to protect. But if there's stuff that's already been altered, it's not providing value to wetland resource areas. So I think it's just an important distinction to make, and might be something that the commission would say, okay, we're not going to be asking you to do mitigation for this previously developed stuff, but we might want some mitigation or avoidance for some new stuff that you want to do. And this is just restating the information about the aura vernal pools and the inner 50 feet being a no disturb zone. And then there's some preservation and restoration of the aura is directly related to the protection of the values. Therefore, the commission will require that all new structures and activities are located as far from wetland resource areas as is practicable. So again, not outlawing anything, but asking for efforts to be made to try to avoid and move away from resource areas when it's possible. If it's not possible, there's not enough land to develop, then those are places where the commission would have the discretion to say that standard is not realistic. There's a lot of flexibility built into these regulations. Okay, moving on. All right, rivers and streams. Here is some scientific preamble information about the importance of rivers and streams and their relationship to groundwater recharge and the complex ecosystem around rivers and streams. They're sensitive resource areas and they're important ones, and important for wildlife protection as well. Then there's definitions here for perennial streams and intermittent streams. And some language here making note that under certain kinds of drought conditions, even a perennial stream may dry up temporarily, but that does not mean it loses its perennial status. And when there are droughts, DEP often issues notices advising conservation commissions that the reclassification of streams shouldn't happen in severe drought